So what I'd like to do is just go through my interview questions. I am sure we'll go on some digressions, but this will at least give us a place to start. The topics for the interview are, well, the overall topic is the art and practice of young adult fiction. And the first thing we're going to talk about is how your life experience has informed your decision to write for young adults and your choices in doing that. Then so I'd like to get into some of your theories on poetic style and craft, because I have read your poetry also. So I know that that is part of your life as a writer. And I kind of want to talk about the interconnections there.
Sure.
Your views on the social and literary need for LGBTQ plus writers and, you know, people who can speak to the needs of young adults. And finally, the nuts and bolts of a technique that's cross-fertilized with poetry and fiction. So the first thing I want to get into just a little bit is your biography, your literary biography, really. I'd like you to describe your childhood, your adolescence, your young adult life, and your life, particularly at age 15, which is Eleanor's and James's age in Everything Grows. And how did your life prepare you to be the writer that you are now?
Ooh. So I often tell my students that poetry saved my life. And I mean that. When I was a freshman in high school, I carried around a book of Lou Reed's lyrics with me. And I joined the poetry club, even though I didn't like joining things. And I just felt as though I was reading words that were inside me, but somebody else was able to put down. And I had a very difficult time in my adolescence. Eleanor, you know, so often we read a book by an author and we think, who are you? Which one is you? You know, I'm all of them. I'm Flor, I'm James, I'm Eleanor. I'm not so much the mother, but when I was 16 years old, I tried to commit suicide for the first time. And there were multiple times after that through the rest of my life, into my 20s, into my 30s. So I've been living with mental illness for most of my life. And when I was 15, nobody talked about that. No one. We didn't see it on TV. Famous people weren't discussing it. And now there's such a beautiful language around it that there's no shame. There's just this open conversation. And my students openly talk about anxiety and mental illness. So when I started writing Everything Grows, and it took me over 10 years to write it, and it had various iterations, it did not start the way it ended.
Oh, okay.
By far. It took on many shapes and tones. And I wanted to write a book that I hadn't seen yet. Now, since in those 10 years, queer literature has just exploded. But when I first started writing it, Eleanor didn't exist on bookshelves yet. And I wanted a story about a person searching for themselves and someone who had experienced a lot of pain in their life, but wasn't feeling it themselves. You know, like she could have easily taken the path that I did. In fact, Eleanor was the person that I wish I was when I was 15. Just like strong and open and aware. I wasn't at all. I mean, I'm still trying to figure out who I am, and I'm 42. So a lot of me made its way into this book, but it very much took on a life of its own as I was writing it.
Was writing something that at that time when you discovered poetry, something that you felt you really had to do, that it was sort of a obsession, really?
I wouldn't say obsession. I would say that it was something, it was the one thing that I wanted to do. I like, nothing felt right. I was a dancer for a number of years. I took dance lessons for years, and I thought, okay, this is me. I'm a dancer. And then I stopped, and then I'm like, I've got nothing. I don't want to do anything. And then I had this wonderful creative writing teacher, and I started to read poetry, and it just made me feel, it made me feel more alive, even as like simultaneously I just wanted to die. So it was more like writing. I hear writers talk about like this just obsessiveness. I can't exist unless I write. I don't feel that way. I don't feel that way. I feel like it's the one thing that I actually want to do, and I feel like I can do.
Right. Tell me about your teacher and how that teacher may be a character like the teacher in your book.
Oh yeah, that teacher is like an amalgamation of my 7th grade English teacher, Mrs. Herkis, and then my high school creative writing teacher, Mrs. Runquist. And then when I went to community college in Hartford, Connecticut, Ken DiMaggio, my creative writing teacher. And so I've only had wonderful English teachers. And I think that that's why I love, like I don't feel that way about any other teacher.
I know just what you're talking about. Those are English teachers. I love that.
Yeah. And so I really do think that that's what played a role in my love. And that's what, like, I'm a teacher now. And so I do everything I can to open the door for these writers who don't think they're writers, who don't want to be writers, who don't want to read what we're reading, because it's all about the approach. So yeah, I wanted to create a teacher in the book where like she, I do that exercise with my students. I have them write a love letter to themselves. I've been doing that for a long time. And I've done it in a number of spaces. I've done it with adults too. And I find that so often, like, there's an immediate resistance of like, what am I going to say to myself? And then watching them come alive. And I've never read any of their letters because they're to them. And what I've done every semester, minus this pandemic, is I take their letters, I put a stamp on it, I hold on to it, and then I mail it back to them. So this beautiful like moment of them being reminded of these kind words they've written to themselves.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that what brought this book out and what has connected me as a teacher, it has been a lot of what came about from just my adolescence of never feeling like I was in the right room.
Right. Do you think that, so much of your book, Everything Grows, is about the establishment of identity and the changes that we go through to try to do that, and how it isn't really a fixed thing. It changes a lot. And eventually, I think Eleanor gets to the point where she doesn't want to label herself, that she's just tired. She just wants to reject, being a thing, that, the way people do. How much of your life as a young adult, how much of your identity was shaped by writing? And how much did you use writing to try to help you formulate an identity?
Like all of it, but it was like a relationship between writing and reading. So I again, with language, right? When I was 15, most of the words that exist around identity didn't exist or weren't articulated. So I wasn't even thinking about my gender identity because I was not wanting to even be alive. So why am I even thinking about what I am? And when I started to write more about, when I started to lift the words inside me and let them out onto the page, that's when I started to know myself. allowed that's how my anger started to come out. And it was safe because it's on the page, it's not hurting me and it's not hurting anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really the books that I was reading that helped me to understand myself more.
Mm-hmm. What were you reading at that time?
Oh gosh. So I was reading, I was reading a lot of the books that people were telling me to read because I was in school.
Right.
But I was always an avid reader, and that has remained as an adult. But like a book that has always had a very important role in my life, which is so strange because it has nothing to do with queerness, is Catcher in the Rye, which I'm rereading Catcher in the Rye again with a student that I'm working with. And as I'm rereading it again, it is, I think he's 17 recounting it, but he's 16 in the book. And like 100% far away from who I am or how I've ever felt. But it's a person, a young person who is like at this moment in his life where he's being kicked out of school. He doesn't really know how he wants to be. Like everything he's doing is wrong. And he just wants to have this adventure and like live life. And that's what I love. It was also music that I was listening to when I was 15 and in high school that helped me to become who I was. Ani DeFranco, Alanis Morissette, Jewel, like females who are really strong and writing their lives and their anger and their emotions in their music.
I love Ani DeFranco. Love her.
Gosh, yes.
I love her. All right, let's kind of start moving into the craft portion of the interview. Tell me about, you said that you spent 10 years working on Everything Grows. Let's go back to 10 years, let's go back to the beginning. What informed your decision to write young adult fiction? Did you even start the book as a young adult fiction? So tell me about what happened in that process that made you come up with a young adult book.
So I started, I think it started as a poem. And I do that a lot where I start as one genre and then it takes different shapes. And I actually think that's a great exercise for writers when they have an idea of something, to write it in as many different forms as they can. So it started as a poem. It was very, very dark. And it was the relationship between Eleanor and her mother. And it was like dark and grotesque. I've been a fan of Kathy Acker for a long time, and it was like just and then it turned into a short story, and I submitted it as an assignment in my undergrad at Naropa, and my teacher gave me really good feedback and said, Aimee, no one's going to read this because you are pushing the reader out, like so far out that it was like, I like reading anything or watching anything that makes me uncomfortable, but it took it too far. Far. So it
was too dark, you think?
Way too dark. And nobody was redeemable. And there was no, like, when you write something, whether it's a poem or a story, anything, there's a reason you're writing it. Okay, so there's that reason you're writing it. But then if you want to share it with others, if you want an audience, you have to let the audience in. And I wasn't. So I had to start it that way to be able to get to what I got. And I like to tell writers that, so often we feel like we have to write something and get it out. I also think it's important to sit on things and let it stew and let it like become. So it went from the dark story. I gave it time to breathe. I didn't touch it for a while. And then I started reapproaching it, and I rewrote it as another short story. And I started to feel its life, and it started to come together. And then I continued writing it. And as the years progressed, the story changed because I changed. And because like the life around me changed, and I interacted with people that found their way into the story. So that played a role in the evolution of it.
Yeah. You know, the book is anything but dark
I know.
now. So let's talk, I'd like you to talk about that a little bit. How do you think it went from such a dark beginning to this really, honestly, I don't want to use a cliche like hopeful, but, you know, a sense that life is going to go on and it does get better.
And so I started dark because I was dark. When I started writing it, I was in the darkest place. And I was feeling a lot of anger. And so a lot of that was toward my mother. So the mother character is loosely based on my mom. And so that's where it was all funneled into. And as I was starting to like fall in love and having beautiful love and discover and loving that discovery, that light found its way into the book. And that's where the darkness got overshadowed by the light and forgiveness. So I started to find forgiveness in myself, toward myself, toward my mother, that I wanted to bring that in. And also toward like the negative people in my life. Like I didn't have a bully like James per se, but he was loosely based on, you know, various bullies that I've had and that I've seen. And I think there's also that forgiveness toward the bully, toward that person who no one starts out that way. No one is like birthed a bully, right? There's life that happens that creates that. And I wanted to bring some empathy toward that character.
Yeah. And you have there's a tremendous amount of empathy. As a person that did get bullied, I have to say that your book was actually helpful to me, you know, to look past, you know, what was going on with Tony Chimblow back then.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Yep. Let's talk a little bit about how your poetics, well, first of all, I'd like to know what your thinking is about your poetics, and then how it affects your style and craft in fiction, and also vice versa, how they kind of feed each other.
Yeah, I've only written one novel. I honestly don't know if I have another novel in me, although I am working on short stories. I think that with poetry, and I've read many books by poets who've written novels, so feeling that merge as a reader as well. I think that like the way that they work together is just seeing the magic in things. I don't think somebody needs to be a poet to see the magic in things. Be like, I don't know, the various shapes that something can take on in an abstract way. But I do think that it allowed me to write in that disco ball sort of way where you're watching something rotate and become and turn and twist. I've had negative feedback from teachers of, well, this is too poetic, Aimee, when I'm writing prose. And that actually stopped me from writing prose for a while. Now I say to myself, thank you for that comment, but no, thank you. I'm going to write the way I write.
Right. You know, this is very interesting to me. I've been on this jag of rereading Flaubert, who I read as a young person, and I don't think I quite got him. And he has so many images that are poetic images in his writing. It's just like, I'm reading, it's like, this is all, you could take this easily and put line breaks in this.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that to say that the two aren't connected it's not true. It's
right,
just not
I agree.
True. Yeah,
and that's like with labeling. Like when I started writing Everything Grows, I didn't think it was young adult. I just wrote it, and then I decided to call it young adult. And like when I work with students now, and they're like, "Well, is this a poem, Aimee? What makes a poem?" And I'm like, "It's a poem if you call it a poem." So we're taught that something has to look a certain way, and that's just accentuating this binary thinking of you're this or you're that. Why can't we be all of it?
Right.
Well, none of it. It's not a poem. It's not, it's words. Why
Right.
must we label? But
Right.
we
It's
label because we have to shelve it somewhere.
right. 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 That's the reason, because it's all just literature.
Right.
It's literature. I know a friend of mine is really struggling with this right now with her novel, because everybody keeps calling it, oh, that's historical fiction. It's like, well, it's not really. Does it
Yeah.
have to, be put in a box? I think the genres really do hurt us in a lot of ways.
I agree. I agree. Or let's purchase more copies so that they're on multiple shelves. We have it in the poetry section. We have it in the historical fiction. We have it, like maybe that's what we need to do.
Yeah. Yeah. It's such an interesting problem, really. How do you think that poetry, both lineated poetry and prose poetry, performance and fiction, nourish each other, or maybe conflict with each other in a good way,
Oh, what
in
a
a
good.
helpful way?
I think they nourish each other in the way that a body nourishes, right? Like we have this one body, but all these various parts that are working together. And so we can like isolate a part of ourselves and say, here's my finger, this is what my finger does, but also my finger is attached to my hand and I need my hand, and they're working together. So they're all a component of themselves. And that's why I said it's a great exercise to make this decision of, you've got your words down and spend time shaping them in various ways. Whether you shape it as a performance piece, you shape it as, a photo exhibition, you shape it as a poem, it's all communicating with each other. And it just, by doing it in that way, it adds to that conversation. I do that a lot with my work. Actually, I would say that that's all I do.
Huh.
I had a professor in grad school who I think it was my first semester. And at the end, he's like, Aimee, enough with the body, write about something else. And I said, no, this is my existence as a writer. I need to keep writing it until I've exhausted, until I don't have anything to say, until I don't have any more questions. And so I think that whatever I'm writing, it's all part of the same conversation. And I think that's okay. That's not a bad thing, because the conversation continues. The conversation isn't over.
Right. I want to take a little digression here, because you've mentioned teachers and you've mentioned grad school. I want to get your opinion, not so much whether an MBA is a good idea or a bad idea, but we do have a lot of readers, and I'm one of them, who is finally getting around to doing an MBA. I mean, MBA, MFA.
Yeah.
I worked in business forever.
Okay.
MFA. And I'm wondering how you feel a student of writing should approach the MFA. What kind of attitude should they take there? And what do you think are the most helpful parts of the MFA, and what are the parts maybe that are can be like a minefield a little bit?
I would say if you're going to get your MFA and you've now reached a point, regardless of your age, where you've spent time writing, right? I would make sure that you have a lovely piece of furniture all around you, whatever shape or texture you want, to make sure no one gets too close to your words. So when I was at Naropa, I took a wonderful class by Maureen Owen called Finding Your Fire, and I did. And it was the perfect timing for a class like that. And I was a non-traditional age student at all my schools. I was older.
Right. Me too.
Yeah. And when I got
older.
and I actually think that benefits you. I think the older student already knows, they know what they want to do. You are motivated, you want it. And so in grad school, I already knew my voice. I knew what I wanted to write. I just needed the space and time to write it. I loved the assignments and I loved the reading, and I was grateful these teachers were teaching about books I didn't know about. But grad school, that's not where you necessarily find your fire. You're just continuing to build that fire. So the carefulness in a grad program is to not allow the people around you to change your voice.
Ah,
Unless I guess you want it to be changed, but generally speaking, you don't. You're honing in on your craft. You're honing in. But
so
I also,
yeah, it's like you want people to help you bring out your voice rather than
not distinguish,
force you
not
in a new
extinguish,
direction.
distinguish. Yeah, yeah. But I also want to put a little asterisk there and say you don't need to go to grad school and get your MFA to be a writer, to be a published writer, any of that. Just write and read. Just write and read.
Right. You know, I'm actually having this experience right now of feeling like, you know, I don't want to engage in that because I feel like I don't need so many people telling me how my poem ought to sound.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to pick, you know, be selective at who tells me.
So find that piece of furniture and put it around you so no one gets too close. And also find the people in your program that you do value their work and value their help in again, like honing in and accentuating your work, because there are going to be those people who try to, well, this semicolon shouldn't be here.
Right.
That's not helpful.
Right. Or why don't you turn this into a poem like such and such as, yeah.
Thank you and no thank you.
Yeah. Okay. I'm very happy for that digression. Thank you. Let's talk about, I want to talk a little bit more about craft again. And I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the styling of Everything Grows. That's an epistolary novel.
Yeah.
And I wonder why you chose that form and how have you bent the rules for that form in writing this novel?
So I love letters. I'm an avid pen paler. Is that a word? It is now. I have
pen
many.
paler.
Yeah, I have many pen pals, some of which live a mile away from me. And I love the beauty of letters, of sharing your handwriting with someone, of having to wait, having to wait for that letter to get to them. And maybe the letter never arrives. So I knew I wanted it to be letter. However, it wasn't all letters initially. So 10 years, many rewrites. When I sent it to my publisher, it was actually, it was not the story that it became now. The support group wasn't in that draft. Meeting James's mother wasn't in there. So again, that's why I think it's so helpful to take your time. Don't rush it, because so much more can come out. I thought it would be easier than it was. It was very challenging to write it 100% epistolary. And that was what my editor suggested. She liked that I had letters sprinkled, and how it initially was you had the letters between James and Eleanor, but they obviously weren't writing to each other. It was because James,
it was his journal and then her letters to him.
And then there was the story, a narration between the letters. My editor said, I want you to write it all epistolary. And I'm like, great, I love that idea. But how? Like, how do you put dialogue in a letter? I was so challenged by that. And when I got 10 pages of handwritten notes on a yellow legal pad, I had a temper tantrum and I cried and said, forget it, I'm done. Like, I don't want to do this. I can't do this. Then I went to Coney Island on Christmas by myself. It was very cold. And I oddly enough was reading Catcher in the Rye at the time. And I was like crying, and I'm like, I don't know how to do this. I'm not a good enough writer to do this. I went home, I was by myself, and I looked at the notes. I had them beside me. I went to my computer and I restarted it. And here's where I resisted. I loved my first line and I didn't want to let go of it. And I had to in order to get this rewrite.
Okay. One line.
I just loved it as my first line.
Right. I get that.
Yeah.
that thing you don't want to part with. But look, you parted with it. You did it.
I parted, yeah. Sometimes you have to have a temper tantrum and cry, resist, and then move on from it.
Wow. Now, the images in your novel, as in your poetry, I have to say, are exquisite. They are just fantastic. And they're sometimes very rapid fire. You know, there's just one after the other. And I'm wondering, how do you capture images? What is your process for image making?
Oh, I don't know. It's how I see things.
Mm-hmm. Do you ever make notes? Do you see something and take a note on it and save it? Or what kinds of things do
Sometimes
you
I
do?
have I journal. I've been journaling for a long time. So sometimes I'll capture, but a lot of times it's just how I think. And I worry that, like, even when I teach, I worry that I over metaphor, because that's how I think. Like,
Okay.
you know, and it helps me to understand. I don't understand when somebody just, well, this is a pen. Oh, okay, but like, what does it feel?
Mm-hmm.
I've just always been that way. And so I will say that has caused me to not be a very good student, like from start to finish, even in grad school. But I guess it helps me as a writer, because I'm able to see something in a different way.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you just used the feeling of the object. So you have I mean, that's like classic Ezra Pound image making, really, you know, that you have a visual or a auditory or whatever the perception is, but it's not an image until you kind of hook it up with a feeling.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. How does that process work for you? Does it just really come so naturally you can't kind of tease out the components, or can you?
Yeah, because I guess it happens naturally, because I can't think about how I do it or what my process is. I just, when I describe, when I teach, I'm overly descriptive. I'm sure it's very annoying to my students, but that is the only way I'm able to, I feel like, get my point across.
Okay.
I never would have made it as a scientist.
Okay. Right. So it's interesting to think about this as like an unanalyzed aspect of your writing. Is that important to keep it unanalyzed?
Well, I feel like I overanalyze everything. So it's interesting to think of one aspect of myself that I do not analyze. And now I want to analyze it.
Ah, okay.
So give me some time to think about it.
Maybe that's something we'll come back to at a follow-up.
Yeah, because I was just going to say, I grew up where my dad fostered imagination in me. We used to listen to old time radio shows, and, you know, we used to go, growing up in New Jersey, or my family, we'd go to the mall because there was nothing else to do. My mom and my sister would window shop. My dad and I would sit on a bench and make up stories about the people passing us. So he always encouraged my imagination to flourish.
All right. Huh. All right, let's talk about some of the nuts and bolts of the writing process here. How often do you write?
Not every day. So I think every day, and thinking is part of the writing process. And some things, like I wrote a short story last year that I'd been thinking about for probably about 6 years, that I had written in my notebook probably 6 years ago, just a thread of it, but it wasn't ready. I'm a very slow writer, very, very slow.
Yeah.
And I try to write every morning in my journal just for a couple minutes, but there's no like 100 words or 5 pages.
Okay.
I don't make rules on my writing. I actually don't think that that's helpful for me. It is for other people, but I find that it's punishing.
Yeah. Yes, it's like a to-do list.
Yeah.
I think you've sort of answered the question. Do you have a schedule at all? for writing?
No, but I do often, when I write, the morning is best.
Is it sort of a matter of priority that you want to do the important job while you're still fresh?
Yeah, although when you say it like that, my priority is my students. So I put them first, and then I write.
That's really cool. Why is your priority your students as opposed to your own work?
I feel emotional even just talking about this. I love teaching, and poetry saved my life, but like teaching makes me feel more alive.
Mhm.
And so if I were to write before I grade, I would be just completely deplenished. I wouldn't be able to look at their work honorably and be able to give them everything that I think that they need.
Right.
And so, yeah, I guess I've never really said that out loud before, in that like I prioritize my students, but I do. I think, I don't think I've ever said, oh, I got to write. I have to write. I always say, well, what do I need to get done for this? And then I make time for writing. I still get that writing done, but yeah, they come first.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like you just gave me permission to have the same kind of feeling. I did teach for 12 years. I'm not teaching now. I was an adjunct professor of philosophy, actually.
Oh,
And I
wonderful.
always wanted to get to their work. And I also have kids who are still in high school. And it is my greatest joy to do whatever it is I have to do for them first. And often I feel like, oh, am I short? I'm supposed to be focusing on my own work here, but I don't often feel like I need to make that first.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I feel like maybe,
After you get your MFA, do you want to teach writing and literature?
no, I'm really just doing it to be part of the conversation about what literature is now. I'm semi-retired from 45 years in advertising.
Oh, wow.
I was a
Okay.
copywriter.
Oh,
And I always wrote creatively, but I had very long breaks because I was, busy. I had a big job kind of. And now this is just sort of, some people buy themselves a, Ferrari or something like that if they have some savings when they get old, and I'm buying myself an MFA.
I love that. What a gift. I
Yeah,
love
it is.
that.
It is a gift. It's really great, actually. I wonder if some people might say that the thing we're talking about now is a women's thing, that they would gender it because we're into the caring.
I hate that. But I can understand, I can see some people saying that. And that's where, so many of the problems of how we are, but we're just focusing on the wrong things. But that, like, it perpetuates that men don't care, women do. And then what about all the people in between? And that's very problematic thinking.
It is. I totally agree. I feel like we need to kind of just say that, though, out loud, that that's problematic thinking. Caring shouldn't be the prerogative of one gendered group.
Right. And what a shame that we're saying only this gender gets to care. Right? Like, no. Everyone
Really.
should.
Yeah. Do you find you're best served by long stretches or short bursts of writing? Does one or the other kind of work better for you?
Short bursts, definitely short bursts. Yeah. It's like, I haven't been to a buffet in a long time, but when I was a kid, we went to buffets a lot of Chinese buffets. And I think that's how I write. I go into a restaurant, I eat as much as I can of varying things. I get really excited, then I get full and I say to myself, I'm never eating again. And until the next time. So I think that's how I write. I go to my computer or I go to my notebook. I write a lot. I gorge and gorge. I rub my stomach and say, that was a delicious meal, I'm never eating again. Or that was a delicious poem, I'm never poeming again.
Mm-hmm.
I take a break and then I go back.
That's pretty fun, actually. I like that. That really is. All righty. You talked about journaling. What's your journal like? What's in there?
Oh, well, here's my journal. Got a lot of stuff in it, and here's some of my handwriting. It's my thoughts, it's things that interrupt my thoughts, it's moments that I capture outside my window, it's quotes that I read in a book. It is pieces of songs, because I'm a songwriter as well.
Oh.
It is ideas of poems I want to write, beginnings of poems, ideas of stories I want to write. Yeah, so a little mishmash of all of that.
It sounds like you don't censor yourself at all about your journal. You don't approach it.
No, never. Nor should one censor themselves. We need a place where we don't have to. And if it's not in our journal, where can it be?
Right. You know, this raises the kind of issue of control. And, you know, sometimes it's tempting. It has tempted me as a writer to say, I only need to do this in my journal. I need to stop writing these things in there and only do a journal that is going to end up being productive. How do you feel about that?
Well, if that works for you, great. But I think that we need to encourage ourselves to be messier. I think we need to be messier and like make mistakes and cross things out and leave those cross outs and interrupt ourselves as writers, as readers, as thinkers. Like I think we need to be more encouraged to do that, but we're not. It's like things need to be pristine and organized, and most of us aren't.
Right.
And more people have OCD and ADD, and our attention is being pulled in all these directions. So we sort of need to allow ourselves to find areas where those directions can get pulled. So if we have these multiple thoughts, put those multiple thoughts in a journal.
Well, this kind of, I think, I want to go on another digression here because it sort of raises a social issue, which is that we're living in a society where we are constantly told, like you say, everything's got to be buttoned up and finished and get it done and get it out and move on to the next thing. How does that, which is completely an industrial mindset, that is a business mindset. What does that do to a writer, and how can a writer push back against that? Because it may not be the most effective way or the most positive way to be a writer, to follow that kind of an approach.
Well, and we all write differently. We think differently. We speak differently. So to say that this is how it should be, that's already a problem, because now you don't leave room for anyone to digress from that. So like I give these rules to my creative writers at the beginning of the semester: be messy, interrupt yourself, get lost, make mistakes. And if we allowed more space for that, took away the word perfect, like balled it up, threw it out the window, stomped on it, pour acid on it, set it on fire. I like, we need to shift how we teach, how to think, how to ask questions, how to write, how to read, because the way that we're doing it, and not everybody, but the way that it's being done is this is how you do it. And not allowing room for a multiple way of thinking to be in the room. I just lost my train of thought, but I just, there's not just one way of doing something, and we should encourage that. What I'm working on creatively right now is, well, I should say what often is my stop sign is, I think, oh, what if this is going to offend someone? This doesn't sound good enough.
Okay.
What if this, right? That's my stop sign. What I'm working on now is not allowing that to intrude. I'm just getting it down. I'm allowing it to take different directions if it needs to. It's not yet, but if it needs to. And I'm not enforcing rules per se. I'm not even thinking about, maybe no one will ever read it, and that's okay. But figuring out what your stop sign is as a writer is super important to then set it on fire and move on.
Let's talk about revisions. It sounds like you revise a whole lot based on what you did with Everything Grows.
Yes.
Tell me about your revision process.
So when I write, I read it out loud. I like to hear it, especially as a poet. I like to hear the rhythm of it and the music of it. And that goes with prose as well. And I let it breathe, really. I write something, I put it away. I don't look at it for a while. And then I approach it again, a couple weeks, a couple months, sometimes a year. And by doing that, it allows me to see it more clearly. And it really helps me to line edit and remove. Okay. And as I've gotten older, I'm much better at removing without remorse of like, oh gosh, well, but I love this image. This is so, no. I needed to write it to get to where it got to. So revision is extremely important, but it's not just like right away. You have to let your work breathe.
Yeah. What else that we haven't covered is important in your process to you?
Oh. I feel like I touched on most things.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, good. I'm going to shift gears again. And I want to talk about art writ large and also the relationship between art and society now. What writers do you emulate? And what about their writing makes them models for you?
So I mentioned Kathy Acker earlier, and I bring her up again because when I first approached her work, and I knew nothing about her. I was just at a used bookstore and I picked up one of her books. I just was blown away by her mixed like media within the book of drawings, charts, a shift in presentation of language, dialogue to symbols to, I just didn't know one could do that. And I was blown away also by the blatant sex positivity within her work, the grotesqueness at times. I love that. I love, I love supporting women writers. I love supporting queer writers. I love supporting like non-binary writers, because so often, because they've been silenced for so long in literature, so long it was like just white cis straight men, that I'm always blown away, because like they've had all this time to stew and cook, and so when you're reading their words, it's like the most delicious meal. Carmen Maria Machado, who is a contemporary writer, like when I read her work, all I think about is I just want to go to your home and just sit beside you. And what she does with language, how she queered the memoir with her newest book, In the Dream House.
Okay.
Blew me away. And then, like when I was living in Colorado, I became fixated on Charles Bukowski, although I liked him before that. And I have most of his books on my bookshelf. and as a feminist, I always get nervous about saying I love Charles Bukowski, but one can coexist within
Yep.
the feminism and also the Bukowski. And what I like about him is what I like about all those other writers, which is that unapologetic, the messiness, that sense of, as a reader, you're uncomfortable by reading the words, but also you're like, well, I actually have felt that as well. And he was a great poet. You know, I love the narrative within his poet. I also love Raymond Carver, same thing, like not same thing as far as content,
Right.
but he was also a great poet and such a wonderful short story writer. That narrative within his poetry I love. But some of the newer writers that are coming out are really blowing me away as well. Tori Peters, whose first book came out. I love getting lost in a book. As a writer, it inspires me, but also just as a human, it inspires me to get lost in someone else's imagination.
Yeah. As a writer, what do you hope to inspire in your readers? Do you have a purpose that impels your writing?
Of course, I want to move people. And I know that I don't have that control. Once you give your poem, storybook away, it's not yours anymore. So they can hate it. They can say it's not written well. They can say it doesn't make sense, you know, but what I hope is that it does what other books do for me, which is make me feel seen, make me feel like, leads me to more clarity within myself. That's what I hope.
Okay. Do you think that there is kind of a common purpose in all good literature?
Yeah, I just like the purpose of connecting, of bringing us closer toward our emotions, or for literature that some people label as what do they call it? Beach reads, where it's like, it's an easy read. But that gives us something too, because it allows us to relax. Walking outside is a chore, but digging into a book, whether it's the finest literature, whatever that means, or like a guilty pleasure, it all gives us something. It allows us to slow down. It takes us off of our phones, right?
Right. Well, now that's interesting. Slowing down and connecting. Those are two things you just mentioned. How are they related?
Oh, because so often we disconnect, even when we think we're connecting. I'm not on any social media. And so like I've had people say, well, Aimee, that's how people connect nowadays. And I'm like, but is it? Because how real is it? And we're just scrolling. I like to disconnect, right? So like try to do my very best to stay off devices while I'm connecting with others. And there's a slowing down in that we're just being around each other and listening to each other and not thinking about our to-do list.
And that is kind of what happens when you get lost in, whether it's a book of poetry or a novel or even nonfiction, if it's a topic you like.
Right.
Yeah. That's kind of cool. I never thought of that connection, but I think you're right there. I really do. I like that idea. What is the role of LGBTQ writers now? And why are these writers, including you, but also the many other writers who are working now, why are you guys important in young adult fiction? Maybe I'd even include myself there, because I feel like, again, these labels, like I may be a straight white woman, but I hate gender roles. So.
Yes, good. So do I. I think their role is to exist and to get recognition for existing. You know, like we're seeing more publishing companies. I see this now when I submit of like, we want BIPOC writers. That's what we're looking for.
Okay.
And that's how it should have been all along, that we're not just opening the door to one kind of person. All these queer writers existed all along, but they haven't been given this opportunity. So their role is just to exist. they don't like, we don't need to impose, well, you need to have queer characters in your books. No, it is enough that they are queer and they're alive. They're alive in their aliveness. I mean, that is enough.
Right.
Although I'm appreciative that they are writing queer stories, because we have been just we've exhausted all the other stories.
Right.
And all those queer stories, again, all those queer stories have existed, but we haven't had the opportunity to read them. So I'm so excited to see more of them. I just remember when I was a kid and I'd go to Barnes and Noble and I would go to their LGBTQ bookshelf, and it was half of a bookshelf. And now you can have an entire bookstore of queer literature. That is exciting. And I want to see more of that.
Right. How does that help young people? How would that have helped you?
Visibility.
And how does that help people now?
Yeah, visibility. Like when I was a kid, there were no gay people that I knew. And yes, of course, there were gay people that were out, but not really, and not in the way they are now. So just having visibility, and it goes beyond just bookshelves. It goes in the classrooms of having more inclusive curriculum where it's not just white men. Shakespeare had his time. I know that's controversial, but let's move on. That's very controversial. Right. Let's leave that part out. All I'm saying is that we need space for more like marginalized communities to have a place in the room.
I want to turn this back to Eleanor and her journey, and how all along the way in your book, writing comes back in and helps her move along on the path that she's on, that she feels compelled to take. And I want to talk really about the thing of not pigeonholing into her identity, but allowing her through writing to have a rich identity. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, isn't that how it is though? We don't, when we learn a piece of ourselves, whether it's our sexuality or gender identity, what food we like, whatever it is, everything else doesn't just immediately come rushing, right? It's
right.
So with Eleanor, I wanted to write a book where, okay, I'm a lesbian, I'm gay. I know there's something else. I'm not quite there yet, but I know it's there. And that so much has been my journey, and so many other journeys where it's not just a flood of we know ourselves completely. It's like little bits and pieces that come together. And it's slow, or for some, I guess it's faster, but it's this sort of little breadcrumbs that we start to pick up and taste. Oh yes, this is me. Like that moment where she meets Ray, and that wasn't initially in some of the earlier drafts, but inspired by someone that, like, you see someone, you're like, you start to recognize yourself in seeing them. It's just like that moment in Stone Butch Blues by Leslie Feinberg, where the character Jess sees someone in a diner with like a big hunk of keys hanging from their, and I, like, as a queer person, I'm like, I know that person. Yes. Like you start to, it's like when you hear words that you connect to, when you see people that you are just hope to be, or start to help you see a part of yourself.
Why am I feeling, as you're saying this, like any book, any poem from any time that doesn't stay open to the character's changing identity kind of fails?
Because that's not how it is. We are not static, regardless of our identities. We are not static. Look at pictures of yourself from 10 years ago. Your hair changed, the type of glasses you wear change, your clothes, what you like, what you don't like, what you listen to. We are not static. And so I think it's so important to have stories, like art, just art that explores that.
Yeah. And maybe that is becoming more and more prevalent as literature advances, because different voices are having to come in. You know, when the voices were primarily the voices of people with a very fixed identity that was, you know, driven home to them, which it was for men for a long time.
Mm.
What else do you want to tell me about your writing, about what you think is a good practice for writers, any of that? What else have we left out?
Well, I just would like to say that for writers, for anyone who's creative or wants to be creative, just be kind to yourself. So often we write something down, we think it's not good enough, and then we stop. Or somebody tells us it's not good enough, so we stop. And it's so much easier to be kind to ourselves than to not. Now, that footnote, I am very unkind to myself, and I am a work in progress.
Right.
But just to keep reminding ourselves about that kindness will help those words come out, and like those words need to get out. Again, they can be messy, it's okay. But every voice deserves to be heard. I was tutoring this young person, and she's in second grade. So wonderful, so smart. And there was a lot of resistance. And I soon learned that she loved poetry. And so we wrote poems together. And there was one day, and this is through Zoom, so I actually never got to meet her in person. And there's one day where she clicks in to the room and she is just bawling and screaming.
She's at what grade? She's in second
grade.
Second grade. Oh.
And so I'm here in my Zoom land, and there's not much I can do. And I'm like, what's going on? Are you okay? Don't ask me how I am. And then finally I said, listen, when I get really angry or when I have emotions, I just don't know how to process or understand. I just scream into my notebook. Do you want to scream into our notebooks together? And so we did. She grabbed hers and I had mine. And she wrote, I don't even know what she wrote. I didn't ask. I screamed into my notebook. And sometimes you just have to scream into your notebook to get it out, to make room for all the beauty that is being stifled by those screams.
Right. I want to ask a follow-up. Something you said in there reminded me of this. Tell me a little bit about the comments and letters that you receive about Everything Grows. What kinds of feedback do you get from your readers?
I've gotten a little bit. You know, I've heard some people say that they that just, even from people who aren't in the LGBTQ plus community, of just being able to experience a story like this and be able to understand a little bit more, or someone who's been bullied and to initially feel uncomfortable by that storyline of like, why are we supposed to feel bad for this bully? But then also, okay, I can also get that and feel a little bit more empathy or kindness toward them. But I love getting letters. I can't get enough. So I always encourage that. I've reached out to writers that I've been moved by. So I think it's so important to do it.
I have too. And it is. I think that's really important for people to do.
Yeah.
How does that process affect somebody who's a fledgling writer? In other words, if they begin to reach out to writers that they like, what does that do for them?
I think it just, it encourages. Like I remember, gosh, years ago, I wrote an email. I sent an email to Kim Adonisio, the poet.
I love her. Yeah.
Oh gosh, who I've since met. And I felt I lost my words being in the same room as her. And I didn't think she'd write back because she's Kim Adonisio. She doesn't have time to write back to some whoever. And she did write back, and she was so kind and generous and, you know, thanked me and really seemed just moved by a reader writing to her.
Mhm.
So I think it creates that, it like creates that connection between reader and writer, because
Right.
it's very intimate as a reader to read a writer's work, but the
Mhm.
writer often doesn't have that connection
Yeah,
back with the reader.
right. It sounds like it's a kind of a form of community building.
Oh, yes.
And I'm going to follow up with that too, because I don't know if you know who Jose Arguaz is. He's a poet. He lives in Boston. He's somebody I like. He's the editor of Salamander Poetry Journal.
Okay.
And he has a blog and he advises people, don't get all bogged down with what he calls the toxic hierarchy of art, of publishing here and got to go here. Build a community instead.
Oh, yes.
I wonder what you think about that idea.
Oh, 100%. When I was in grad school, I had a rough time because I don't really like school, which is also controversial as a teacher. But I spoke with a mentor at the time, and she said, Aimee, you're in New York, find your community, build it. So I did. I went to open mics and I met people who are still in my life and who are really important people in my life. And so if you feel like you need to find that bridge toward others to encourage the words from you, go somewhere, find an open mic. Open mics have always been an important part in my life. Find other writers and talk to them and ask them questions, and I've gone to writing workshops. I've led writing workshops. Those are really helpful as well. To connect, to reconnect, to build that community.